we've got a lot of women on the retreat. This is retreat weekend. Yeah. So this is why our male count is up and our female count is down. Our ratio is different than usual. So hopefully others will catch up with us. And we can't blame the weather today for anything. Actually, last Sunday was the perfect church weather. It was the perfect church weather because it wasn't freezing, it wasn't ice or snow, but it wasn't sunny. So you couldn't have an excuse either direction. Yeah, it was a good day to go to church. That's right. Because you couldn't be doing your outside activities, but it was where you could drive safely. Right? And
our former minister of music, Bill James, when he retired, they moved to Fredericksburg, and they came home one weekend. So I said, well, are you going to church? He said, well, you know, some Sundays we just wake up and say, it might rain.
it always might rain.
The deacon on pretty Sundays would come up to me and say, if they're not here today, they don't like you. I had a couple of deacons that way.
Oh my. Well, welcome everyone, and we'll have folks still come in. That's fine. Did everyone get a handout today?
Yes.
It's a lot of scripture today. So, in our journey through the parables, we will focus really only on that first passage today. I want you to have the other two references to this because it's just more than we can read right now. This is the parable today of sometimes called the parable of the faithful stewards or the faithful servants. And it appears chronologically first in Luke, but it's probably better known out of Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark are just almost verbatim in their presentation of this. The Luke context is a little different as well. So would someone be willing to read for us the passage from Luke? Who'd be our reader today?
I can.
All right, Carol Ann. Let's listen to Carol
I
Ann.
have a big mouth, so no problem.
Speak up.
Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Peter said, Lord, are you telling us this parable for us or for everyone? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and prudent manager whom his master will put in charge of his slaves to give them their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. Truly I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and if he begins to beat the other slaves, men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour that he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. That slave who knew what his master wanted, but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted, will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required, and from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded.
Thank you, Carol Ann. Just a couple of notes to help you understand the context here versus Matthew and Mark. The Luke version is actually the milder version of this. So if this were salsa, we would label this one mild, and we would label Matthew and Mark hot, because they're much more graphic. Look at the end of the Matthew passage. The one who does, the master or the slave who doesn't do what's right, the master when he comes will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Oh, look at
Now, same thing in Mark with that. Also, Matthew and Mark set this in a bit more of an apocalyptic end times scenario than is evident in Luke, but really that's implied in Luke, right? So it's interesting the way Luke and Matthew and Mark use this story that Jesus told in slightly different ways. Now, I got a little confused this week because when I read this passage, I immediately thought of an experience from my childhood and youth that some of you probably are thinking of as well. Anyone subjected as a child or a young adult, some of you would have been, to the 1972 classic movie, A Thief in the Night?
Oh, yeah.
If you grew up in a Baptist church or an evangelical church in the South, you would have been exposed to this. Somehow you missed it. Okay, this is Chad. Did you see it? Oh, thank you. Okay, I was yeah. So I thought this was a Billy Graham film, but it turns out it's not. But Billy Graham, who died this week, really paved the way for something like this because starting in the 50s, one of the extensions of Billy Graham's ministry was a Christian film ministry. And he started a film company, you might have known this, called Worldwide Pictures. And back in the days of film projectors in churches and flannel boards, not kidding, yeah, it's before PowerPoints. It was very common for churches, like on a Sunday night or a Wednesday night, to show movies, Christian movies. And a lot of these were Billy Graham movies, like the Nicky Cruz story, Run Baby Run. Yeah. This movie called A Thief in the Night is one that was shown in churches, but turns out it was not a Billy Graham movie. It was someone else. Think early Left Behind. Okay? This was Left Behind before Left Behind. And it would scare the hell out of you. I mean, it just was intended to do that.
Was it really?
That was the purpose. Preston, did you see the movie? Did you show
Oh,
it?
no, my pastor wouldn't let me see those.
Yeah, so A Thief in the Night is drawn from this parable and also from 1 Thessalonians 5:2, another passage. And it tells the story of this woman who wakes up one morning and discovers that all of her friends and family members have been raptured, and she's left on the earth with all the unbelievers, and she really thought she was a believer, but she hadn't really gotten around to make it official. Okay, this is the movie.
Wait a minute.
Right.
You're not making this up.
I am not making this up.
Okay.
This movie has been seen by 300 million people around the world.
Checking Netflix right
It's out there. It's a classic. It is a Christian horror movie. All right? Am I right, Carol Ann?
Absolutely. Scared the daylights out of me.
Yeah, I was probably in elementary school whenever we saw it at church, and it's one of those things that, yeah, I mean, it would scare you straight. Yeah, absolutely. So I thought of that movie with this because that's really the approach the church has taken to this parable way too often. We use this to scare you into not doing bad things. right? Again, speaking of my own upbringing in church, when you read this parable about, basically the interpretation is Jesus is coming. Jesus is going to find you doing whatever you're doing. So you better not be doing anything bad. Right?
Right.
Oh, yes.
Isn't that the teaching? Carol Ann and I have come from the same place. Right? Yeah, and Chad.
I thought all churches did that.
I know! I'm just shocked that so few of you have seen this movie. You gotta go look it up. Yeah. It's still out there. Well, what I want to propose today out of this parable is that maybe the issue is not that Jesus is going to come and catch us doing something bad, but is it possible that Jesus could come and catch you doing something good?
That'd be nice. That'd be real good.
Yeah, because the parable Jesus is telling is not necessarily about, doing something you're not supposed to be doing. It's about, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? There's two different ways of looking at the world through this, right? So, one commentator I read talked about this whole notion of this kind of movie and the Left Behind series and all of our fascination with the end times as apocalyptic voyeurism. I love that phrase. Apocalyptic voyeurism. A bit of eschatological reality TV to pass the time. And that's sort of, it's easy to get worked up over trying to figure out the end times and when Jesus is coming and all of that. But instead, what Jesus is doing is he's inviting us into a different kind of waiting. So, where do we begin in unwrapping this parable? I think we begin with the opening line in verse 35. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Like those who are waiting for the master to return. So, again, this is a call not just to not be doing bad things, but to be doing good things, right? To be ready to serve God. Another place to begin this conversation is to ask, what time is it? What time is it? And by this, we're reminded of the importance of not being distracted by things that don't matter, but to be faithful to the Lord's work that does matter, right? What time is it? It's not asking, is Jesus returning today or tomorrow, and trying to put a date on that, but in the greater sense of time, Jesus is teaching that it's always the right time to be attentive to the Lord's work. And what is that work, right? Is it evangelism? Is it missions? Is it social action? What is it that Jesus wants us to be doing? What do you think?
All of those things.
All of those things? Someone else? What is Jesus, if we're to be ready and active, what is it we're supposed to be doing?
Maybe we're supposed to be saved first ourselves and then maybe pass the message on to others. And at the same time, when you do that, give someone a cold cup of water in his name. It'll be a lot easier when it's 100 degrees outside if you give someone a cold drink and then talk to them about God.
Okay. Someone else? Well, let's talk about Billy Graham some more. He's on everyone's minds this week with his passing. George has an interesting reference that's probably an easier to go down reference to Billy Graham in the sermon today than what I'm about to say. And I like Billy Graham. I don't like Franklin. I like Billy. The nut has fallen far from the tree with Franklin, but that's another story. So there's, among all the things that have been written this week honoring Billy Graham, one of the most interesting I read was a piece written by a guy named Mel White. And Mel is a guy who has been a ghostwriter for a number of Christian evangelical figures through the years until they discovered he was gay. And then they didn't really want to use him anymore. But that's a whole other story. He was very close to Billy Graham and helped write several of Billy Graham's books that were very successful. And he wrote a column that was a tribute to Billy Graham, really longingly thinking of the good times they had together and the work they had done together as well. And one of the most interesting stories he told was in one of the early books that he was working on with Billy Graham, the original draft that Billy wanted of this particular book combined evangelism and social awareness in action. As Carol Ann said, not just the get you saved part or scare you into getting saved part. This might have been about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as I recall. But it also included what was Billy's awareness, because of his own upbringing and circumstances, that the gospel, if it's complete, includes a call to action. And Mel says, much to his surprise, when they got the proofs back of the book before it was published, all of that had been cut out. All of that social action business had been cut out. Not by Billy, but by his handlers, who were concerned about fundraising. Because carrying on the work that Billy did with the Crusades and everything that he did required a lot of wealthy donors. And this was a message his handlers felt like would muddy the waters, right? So I thought of that story when reading this and asking, what time is it, right? It is tempting to say, well, it's time to raise money. Because that's what's required. And how many pastors, how many churches have been driven into mediocrity by the desire to raise money, right? Because it's all about staying alive in a way. So Jesus is saying, I think, that you've got to be ready for an evaluation at any point. It's sort of a snap evaluation kind of deal. Or what do you call it in school, a pop test?
Pop quiz.
Yeah, something like that. That's a different way to think of this. Ann?
Well, another example of him being ready and being discreet, in his biography, Just As I Am, which is about that thick,
Yeah,
it's well worth the read. When they were traveling, the team was traveling, some of his team always went into the hotel room first, made sure there was nobody in there lurking like a woman, and they never ever let him be in the presence of a woman by himself. That's how.
Yeah. It is a fascinating biography. If you want to go delve into this man's life. Again, George has a reference to this in the sermon today that's thoughtful as well. But let's come to think about this parable of being prepared and doing the work of the master while the master's away. Shirley?
Well, those of us that are in companions in Christ are at the point where we're trying to figure out what it is we're good at. And that's an interesting exercise. And those of us that have done strength finders, we're given 5 things, whatever they mean, to do that. But it's also interesting to listen to people talk and for one individual to say, I kept being asked to teach and I wasn't comfortable doing it, but I felt I should do it and it never went well. And I finally learned I didn't have to say yes because I couldn't teach. and strength finders affirm that, where there are those of us that say, I've tried working in the preschool, and it's not good for me or the children to be in preschool. So I've always come to believe that whatever God asks you to do, God equips you to do, but it's not always easy figuring that out. Sometimes it's trial and error of what to do. And I also ask the question, do we learn what our gifts are by what we do, or do we do what we're doing because of our gifts? And it's a two-way street. That some things come very easy for you, and some you run the other way.
So I want to pick up on this lovely point, because what Jesus is saying in this parable is that basically this is about a slave who's in charge of other slaves, right? The masters, or we'll talk about who's who in this story in a minute. What Jesus is saying is that the slave who's in charge is responsible for what they've been entrusted to do. Whatever it is they've been entrusted to do. And to Charlene's point, we've got to figure out what is it we've been entrusted to do. And the church, too often, has had a uniform answer to that question for everyone. Because you're expected to be the next Billy Graham. You're expected to be out evangelizing everyone, even if you don't have the gift of evangelism. Or you're expected to teach, even if you don't have the gift of teaching, right? Or you're expected to sing if you don't have the gift of singing. That might be a little more obvious. Do you understand? Has anyone had that experience? Yeah, there's a uniform answer to what your calling is. We know what your calling is, and we don't even know you, right? Anyone? Okay.
Mark,
Yes.
I'm sitting here trying to think of where the reference is, but in the same line of the spiritual gifts, and companions in Christ, there's the reference in the Bible about the body of the church, and each of all
Yes.
the members being parts, and all the different gifts that people are given, but not all gifts. It doesn't say that all gifts are given to everybody.
That's right. And it's easy to forget that part when you're trying to pigeonhole. Yeah.
But it takes all the parts to make the whole.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not going to finish the jigsaw puzzle. You can be very frustrated. Yeah. Here's a line from a commentator. The focus on faithfulness here reminds us again that Christian faith is not about believing certain ideas, but about living out convictions over the long haul. The church is often impressed with claims to faith. Claims and short-lived faith suffice for nothing. What counts is faithfulness to the end. Faithfulness to the end, even when no one's watching, as they say, right? Now, the big idea in this passage is really about preparation. And this is a reference back to the Exodus and the Passover. What happened when the children of Israel were instructed to get ready to leave in the Exodus? Do you remember what they were told to do?
You mean for the Passover?
What they were to take, how they were to prepare?
Not much.
Not much. Right? They essentially took the clothes on their back, and they had to have food prepared. Polly?
I'm just gonna say that they were also told to get a lot of stuff from the Egyptians to take with them.
Yeah, they did.
Jewelry and all that.
Feel for the Egyptians, but that's another story. Yeah. Yeah, so the idea of being ready, of being prepared. So be dressed for action, have your lamps lit. Be alert. Look at the description that's given throughout this parable in each case. Now, if we stop and think, what did this parable mean when Jesus told it? What was the application at the time? We often, from Christian eyes, read it as Jesus predicting his second coming. But that's probably not the way it was heard by the early church. Luke, in particular, seems to suggest that Jesus is referring to the series of events that will happen after his death, that he knew would happen within the lifetime of those he was speaking to. And indeed, a lot of difficult things happened, including Jesus' death and resurrection, his ascension, left them there, and then ultimately, Jerusalem is sacked, and there's a lot more difficulty with this. Now, another point about this is that this is one of 5 I'm just sort of scattershot here. Sorry. This is one of 5 parables in the New Testament that involve a story about a master's departure and return. So if you think you've heard this setup before, you have. It was a common thing that Jesus used to tell a story. There's the story of the doorkeeper in Mark, the story of the talents, given 3 different talents and the master comes back. There's the story of the minas in Luke, and the wicked tenants. And this is a popular device used by the rabbis to talk about a master departing and returning, and what does the master find upon return. So Jesus is following the rabbinic tradition as he's doing this. All right. There's another thing that we might miss out of this. With all the stern warnings of punishment and so forth, it would be easy to miss the image early on where the master serves the faithful servants. There's a portion in here where maybe this is in Matthew.
No, 37.
37. Yes, yeah, he will fasten his belt. Yeah, I was looking at the wrong portion. He will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. Okay, so this is a radical idea that Jesus is promoting in this parable. The master will serve the servants. So this idea of fastening the belt has to do with wearing loose clothing, and if you're going to do serious work, you've got to gird yourself up so that you don't get tangled up in your flowing robes, the looser clothing of that era and location, right? That's what that belt is about, most likely. Those who heard this story for the first time were shocked, most likely, to hear about the master who invited his servants to sit down while he waited on them. This is just not the way things were done. So, what do you think that has to say to us out of the parable? Why is that there?
Maybe it means that if the master can come and wait on us, then we of all people should be able to wait on those that are less fortunate than us.
I think that certainly is a reading you can take from it. Can you think of other examples in the New Testament of something like this?
When Jesus washed the disciples' feet.
Yeah, Jesus washing the disciples' feet is a good example. Indeed. Yeah. And it goes to that other saying of Jesus that at the end of days, the last will be first and the first will be last, right? There's a demonstration.
That's about it.
Oh, there's a demonstration of humility within this, right? Someone else with a thought on that?
I think that one thing that sticks out to me, because you can basically look at 38 through 47 with all the different iterations and whatever, he's leveling it. There are no, like, you're a slave in charge of these slaves. Well, guess what? You still have slaves. So, you're the boss of your employees, but you're still employed by the same company. And
Right.
there's only one master. Everyone else is equal. And I think that would have also been radical at the time.
So if you have trouble with the idea of a slave being in charge of other slaves, think about Joseph in Egypt. This is exactly the position he found himself in, which was our view of slavery is shaped by American slavery, which is not necessarily the way this has been other places in the world, and would have been in ancient times as well. Now, this gets us to the troubling question: why is Jesus telling a story about slaves anyway? Right? There's several things about this parable that are really harsh. And the beginning point is, why slaves? Anyone have a good idea?
Well, I have a question. Why Jesus, above all people, doesn't just say free slaves? There shouldn't be any slaves.
Someone want to answer that question? Why isn't Jesus going around freeing the slave? I mean, he's healing people. He says he's come to bring freedom for the captive. That's what he says at the beginning of his ministry. And now here he is telling a parable about slaves.
And cut them to pieces and
Yeah.
all kinds of stuff.
Maybe in this social setup and this time, these slaves did not want to be free because that was their means of survival. That was like, they had a job, they were gonna be fed and taken care of. I mean, I don't know.
Well, no, I think that's probably part of it. Yeah, I mean, Jesus would have been boycotted with a hashtag easily.
Was it not the right time and place? I mean, there's always I mean, I hate to say it like that, but like there are, like he tells Jesus tells the disciples, don't go and tell of these works because it wasn't the right. He's not
Right.
ready for the Sadducees and Pharisees. It's not his time yet. So there is a time and place, and you hate to think that some people have to suffer longer because it's not his timing, but that is.
So I think that's part of it. I think that's certainly a part of it, that Jesus couldn't upend every social convention and still make the point he needed to make and do the work he needed to do. Even Jesus couldn't. How much less can we sometimes, right? If you feel like you're not being effective.
And I think the parable needs to be something people can relate to. That's right. It's
Yeah.
like the story that Nathan told. There's a reason he told a story about a lamb to David.
Right, because he was a shepherd.
Because he was a shepherd.
Right. Yeah, I think this is really an important point in this. Jesus is speaking in a way that the people who are hearing him would understand what he's talking about. It's difficult for us to hear today, right? Because of where we are, but in that context, it made more sense. Now, what about all this cutting up business? I mean, this is, there's beatings and there's severe beatings and light beatings, as if that's better, right?
Yes.
Mine says lashes.
Lashes, yeah. And being cut in pieces and sent away, and oh my goodness. What do you make of that?
Is it mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, being cut in pieces?
Just a minute. Let me get to my notes here. Not like this, no. There's some Old Testament references. There are also glory stories. Yeah. So this word, the Greek word behind cut in pieces, actually means cut in two or cut into pieces. And though it's often softened in some translations, it speaks to the cruelty of the ancient world and the shock value of some of Jesus' parables. Remember, Jesus is trying to get your attention with this. Some have suggested that this refers to physical death and being placed with hypocrites and unbelievers to eternal punishment. Some follow the suggestion that this word is a more literal and dramatized rendering of a Hebrew expression meaning to be cut off in the midst of. To be cut off in the midst of. So it's not about physical, this is not the magician sawing you in half. Really? This time, not just a trick. but it's about being cut off from the people, from the communities. One commentator has looked at Psalm 37 as an equivalent to this, and says that Jesus' parable is an end times, an eschatological version of this psalm. The righteous waiting patiently for the Lord, giving generously, you will inherit the land. The wicked abuse others, and you're cut off again. Same thing here. So the idea is that if you're not faithful, if you're not found faithful, you'll be cut off. Not that you cut in half, you'll be cut off.
Okay, this is interesting. Neither his version nor mine go past verse 37 in that chapter. They stop. Now, how can that be?
What, tell us.
In which?
Mark 13
Oh, in
goes
Mark.
only to 37.
Well, but also
I
in
know,
Mark
but your
passage.
Mark
Okay.
passage has
Oh, you're
it
right.
going to 51.
Right.
So, well, what's the deal?
Right, chapter 13.
Chapter 13, both of, now mine is the Message, and you know, there's some, it's kind of different, but his is just a straight translation.
It's a real Bible.
And it's the same way, and it just goes to 37. Did you add those in, Mark? You did, didn't you?
Yours ends at 37?
Does everybody's go to 51?
But after you embark on
What, 37?
Yours goes to 37.
This is NRSD. Well,
Okay. Because it
Let's,
skips all that cut nothing to pieces.
That's right.
okay, I'm just gonna double check and make sure I'm not letting you straight here.
But the kind of pieces aren't, oh, the kind of pieces.
They're in Mark 2.
Maybe they just ran them together.
Okay, I've done something wrong here. Because Mark only goes to 37.
Okay.
It's another mashup. We're really doing mashup theory. Yeah.
Did you do this?
Oh, you know what?
No.
There's a reason,
They're so alike.
they're so alike.
They're exactly the same.
I printed
Matthew twice.
Matthew twice.
Oh, you did?
Oh.
That's why they're so alike.
Thank you for catching that. Yeah, Mark says something else.
They were hoping to alleviate the cutting up part from the Bible.
Yeah, so Mark, it does begin in 1328, right? But it ends at 37, right?
Yep.
It is very similar. Okay, mystery solved on that. Thought I was making up parts of the Bible now. So let's talk about that weeping and gnashing of teeth business, just briefly. This is a way of expressing extreme sorrow and emotion. It's a turn of phrase that gets used, much like we would have some colloquialism. You can think of a bunch of examples of that. This is a colloquial expression. However, it appears only 7 times in the New Testament, and 6 of those are in Matthew. So Matthew really likes this phrase. Yeah. Matthew really likes this phrase.
Now, does Matthew also somewhere talk about weeping and wailing and gnashing
Yes,
of teeth?
same idea.
All same idea, okay.
Yeah. I got a little too far away on this master business, master and thief. If you read about the thief, and you got to figure out who is that, right? Here's what one commentator says: a misstep in interpreting this passage is to equate Jesus as the thief. A more accurate interpretation understands it as an analogy that underlines not only the unexpectedness of the Son of Man's return, but also the urgency of the matter. The owner's house being robbed is a serious matter. It is an intrusion and a violation of personal space and property. Similarly, the coming of the Son of Man is a serious and urgent matter. He will bring about an eschatological judgment in the most disruptive way. The listeners, however, can be ready despite the temporal uncertainty. So it says Jesus will come like a thief in the night. It does not say Jesus is a thief in the night. See the difference? there's the analogy, that may be a distinction without difference to you, but I've got to say it. I'm required to say that. Okay, we talked about the harsh punishment. Now, what about this business of the signs of the times? Because, let me get back to that movie, A Thief in the Night. Not only was it groundbreaking in 1972, it also introduced, that was really one of the launches of what became contemporary Christian music. Because one of the songs in that movie became very popular. It's called I Wish We'd All Been Ready. That one.
Well, that's Christian, though.
That's it.
I know.
Yeah.
I wish we'd all been ready. There's a time to change your mind, the sun is coming, you've been left behind.
There you go. Anyone else know that song? I
Because
forgot
Doug
the guy's
said you
name
need to have
who
a
was on the
pleasant
film.
sounding voice.
Yeah.
Every time Doug puts all those signs up, like he's begging people for a car, and then he says that singing pleasantly is a positive, and I'm like, okay, done.
So there is within this parable an expectation of the end times in a way, right? Whether it's speaking about the trials to come for those who heard it, but also in a way it is looking forward to the redemption of Christ within this. So what does this have to do with us? And if we are ready, and what's that phrase again from Luke? If we're dressed for action, they have our lamps lit. Right? What does that mean for us? If we're anticipating the kingdom of God, what does that practically mean for us? Thoughts?
We should be living what we're called to do.
That's the money answer right there. Yeah. We should be living what we've been called to do. Don't be found not doing what you're supposed to be doing, in other words. I mentioned earlier, we tend to think of the negative, but there's a positive to it, right? To be found doing good, it's not just not to be found doing bad. Yeah, there's like triple negative in there somehow. I don't know. Darn it. Come back up here. Here's a line from one of the commentators that I read. Certainly the consumerist culture of North America has failed to read the signs of the times with regard to its deeply pathological relation to creation. We have demonstrated ourselves to be as the slave who knew what his master wanted, but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted. The severe beating will come in the form of rising seas and failing crops and surging temperatures and droughts and floods and ever more violent storms, as has already begun. To the extent that we mistreat our fellow slaves and overconsume at the expense of creation, we can anticipate the divine judgment. So what this commentator is saying is that the beating that's talked about for those who disobey and mishandle the charge they've been given is sort of built in, right? It's a part of creation. And when we neglect the care of creation as stewards of the earth, bad things happen to us. And you can play this out in any number of scenarios. Someone want to?
Mark?
Yeah.
I thought about this because this morning I was reading some stuff on Facebook about the shootings and all that kind of good stuff, and I don't want to get off into those, but they were talking about gun control and this kind of gun and all that kind of stuff. And one person said, why was it in the 30s and 40s and 50s we didn't have all these mass shootings and stuff? Then they said something because we didn't have the assault weapons and all that kind of good stuff. But I was thinking like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we went to church with our parents. And today there are so many people who are just leaving God out of their lives that I think that's playing a big part in our sickness of our nation. Just my
So
opinion.
in so many ways, you reap what you sow.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's another parable of Jesus. But it's connected. And I don't mean to imply that when bad things happen, you always have caused it, right? Because sometimes bad things just happen, right? Sometimes things go awry not because you planted a bad seed. But the inverse of that is that when you plant a bad seed, almost always something bad's going to come from it, right? So that's really what this parable is saying about the beating that comes. It's really a judgment, right, that falls upon those who don't act wisely with the thing they've been put to take care of.
Well, and I always take solace in the times that those that were in the presence of Jesus were still incompetent. So Lord loved Peter for saying, like, are you talking to us? Like,
You talking to me, Jesus?
You're talking to these other people.
What are you talking about, Willis?
This doesn't apply to me. He's sitting right there, and he's like, but you're not. What are you talking about? Like, you're talking about those
Yeah,
people.
the Pharisees, right? Because they're the obvious sinners. Not me, Lord.
Yeah.
Right? Not me, Lord. So in this call to faithfulness and faithful living, there's so many examples we could give. I'm looking at John Eric, I'm thinking, okay, if you don't prepare financially, there's not going to be magic fairy dust that's going to come and give you something when you've saved nothing, right? If you go to school and you don't study, there's no magic fairy dust that's going to make you have a good grade when you didn't study, right? And life is like that as well. If we are not doing the things we've been called to do by God, we're not going to be found faithful.
And we have to get to know him before we know what he wants.
Yeah. But you can't just spend your whole time getting to know him.
Exactly, but there's,
Yeah, it takes both, right? Here's the both and. And let me go back to Billy Graham as the example in this. How would the world be different today if Billy Graham had been able to combine his belief in both evangelism and social action?
Which is a part of the mystery to me for Franklin Graham.
Because he does the social action.
Because he does the social,
Yeah.
big time,
Yeah.
all over the world. But he does that. That's over there, so to speak.
Right.
Not here.
Right.
And there's a disconnect somewhere.
There is a disconnect somewhere. Yeah. That's an excellent point, Preston. Yeah. It's a mystery. But yet, on the other hand, it's sort of the culture of the evangelical church of a past era, when it was wonderful to send money to send missionaries other places.
As a young person, and looking back a long way, I do not ever remember hearing of my pastor preaching Matthew 25. When did we see you? Now, I might have been paying more attention to that cute girl beside me than I was the sermon. But he was very, he baptized 5,000 people in his ministry of that church. And we did Lottie Moon and some special projects. But we were just a mile or so from stop 6, which was a bad part of town and going down. We would go over there and help with the Vacation Bible School because they didn't know how to do it. And then go back to our side of town and not want them in school with us. So
There's the disconnect, right? And we've talked about this before. The social action without the evangelism is not enough, and evangelism without social action is not enough. You gotta have the whole thing, right? And we tend to pick and choose with that.
Can't upset the donors.
You can't upset the donors. And therein lies the, yeah. Therein lies the problem, right? Yeah.
But Mark, we just said that some of us are better at one thing than
Right.
another.
Yes.
And it was obvious that evangelism was his gift.
Oh, right.
So
Remarkable.
the fact that he didn't emphasize social action doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think that he missed out. It was just that that was his big emphasis. That's what he was gifted at.
And you can certainly make a case for, focusing on what you do well.
Yeah.
In the
Yes.
50s, he insisted that his crusades be
Integrated.
Integrated, yeah.
Yeah.
And he would refuse, when he would sit down with a committee and they wanted to talk about it, he would refuse to go to a non-integrated place to preach. Now, that was in the early 50s, before Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah, an excellent point as well, Preston. And
So that was social action in his own way.
in its own way, in his own way.
I mean, he wasn't pushing everybody who came forward in his crusades to then go out and make he probably in his heart wanted that, but he wasn't organizing those people into social action, but he was making decisions that were, and speaking up for the certain marginalized people at least.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line that I want to leave you with out of this parable today is,
You better be ready.
yeah, I wish we'd all be ready, right? And by that, I mean that we will be found faithful and active. If you want to use this to scare yourself to not do bad things, fine. But the more you're doing good things, the less bad things you'll do anyway, right? Idle hands are the devil's workshop. So think instead about, will you be found doing good when the master returns? Last thoughts on this before we have our prayer time? Thanks to those who joined us on live stream. We'll leave you now as we turn to our prayer.